I wanted to make a tutorial where I got to kind of talk about the specific features like of something kind of so zoomed in. You know, I spend a lot of time when I'm working on my Patreon videos, kind of focusing on basically the structure of the whole head, right? So if you're doing a portrait, you know, you want to talk about really kind of big ideas in terms of the big planes of the head and, you know, the anatomy of the skull and the face and so on. But I really was like looking forward to kind of doing these kind of tighter close-ups. I did one on the eye actually already, and I think I actually kind of want to redo it. I mean, I like in some ways where the other one ended up, but I did it with a lot of like digital graphics, and I think actually I prefer something a little bit more analog in that respect. So I'm going to kind of dive into that. What's really got me kind of jazzed up about like this drawing in particular is kind of looking across all of the forms and kind of making sure that kind of each part of the ear has its own kind of roundness, right? That everywhere where you have a kind of a plane shifting or kind of turning under, that the values are helping you to kind of communicate that. And like that's kind of the place where I'm at right now with this, is just making sure all of that is coherent, that it all aligns. It's a couple of questions about like pencils and lead hardness and stuff. This is a Pentel 120A3DX. It's a 0.3 millimeter lead holder. I find that is actually really good for kind of touching up things at the end, kind of getting into small cracks in the paper to get those values just so even. It doesn't figure into too much of my like kind of block in like the early stages of the drawing. But later on, you know, like I said, I think it's a great kind of finishing tool. Also, the hardness of lead that I have in this one is I think it's a B. I usually have my 0.3 millimeter pencils kind of loaded up with lead that's a little bit softer, just so I can get a little bit more kind of value out of it. So like I said, I'm usually using it also at the end where, you know, I have the values, the drawing kind of fully realized. And so like I don't need as much like maybe the 3 H's or the 2 H's. But it's like little areas like this where the transition's a little bit broken by this lighter value that kind of creeps in. That's what I'm getting into. Someone asked to repeat the pencil, so it's Pentel 120A. Wow, I have a really hard time pronouncing this. What is up with that? This is a Pentel 120A3DX 0.3 millimeter pencil. And I find also like these pencils are really great kind of workhorses in the sense that you know, I've had a lot of different kinds of mechanical pencils. And you know, some of the nicer ones, some of the more expensive ones that I bought, you know, you drop them once and they're done. Whereas like these Pentels are just, you know, I drop them 100 times and they're incredibly resilient. So for artists like me, I find it's really perfect. If you're somebody who like, maybe you draw on a table, so you never like really drop your pencils. You know, maybe that wouldn't matter, but for me, it's actually kind of a big deal. Maybe I should just kind of figure out how to not drop my pencils. But until then, these Pentels are really, really good. Yeah. I know there are a couple questions that kind of went by that I missed. So sorry about that. But if you pop them back into the comments, I might get them the second time around. I see one of my patrons there, Tiago, is watching. Hello to you. Let's see, someone's asking if I've ever used the 2 millimeter lead holders. I have actually, and I have one that I really like. It's kind of a bit like the kind of Cadillac of these. It's actually really heavy and really comparatively very expensive for a pencil, but it's the Rotring Rapid Pro 2.0. And I like actually that it has a clicking action to the lead. And I usually keep like in that I have, I think probably like a 4B lead. So it doesn't really figure into this drawing. But when I need to get kind of big, kind of rich value areas, that's when I'll use something like this. And then someone was asking about shading. How do you shade well? It's complicated is the best answer to that. I mean, in drawing, like there are so many elements that are necessary to succeed in for a drawing to be quite good. Of course, shading is one of those, which is to say, like using values and using those values to kind of create planes. I guess the best thing that I could say about how do you wind up shading very well or using values very well, it's a lot about kind of considering what is the direction of your light source and what direction is the form that you're drawing facing in relationship to that light source. That advice probably on its own actually doesn't fix things, but when you are drawing and practicing with that advice in mind, that's how you actually get better. Also, like, you know, again, another one of my patrons I think is asking a question. Screen name is Gratefully Dead. But the question is like, how much pressure do you put on? I always balance my hand on the paper when I'm putting on value. This allows me to have like an incredibly light touch on the tip of the pencil. In fact, usually when I'm putting on value, I'm really barely kind of touching the paper. You know, if I really pressed in, this B lead could get me to a very, very kind of dark kind of value level. But I consciously try to kind of control that and hold that back. You know, have enough kind of restraint to keep the values, you know, more attuned to being kind of even than necessarily like super dark. And I think that's a great kind of misconception about values. And I think it's actually probably the thing that we do when we run out of kind of useful ways to create form is we start darkening things prematurely. And so with that in mind, holding back a lot, both in terms of holding your pencil at the back, balancing your hand on the paper, and also, you know, not just going initially for the kind of immediate effect that that kind of pushing your values really dark will give you. I do have actually a lot going on today, so I only had a moment to kind of step in for this live stream, but maybe I have time for like one more question. If someone has a question, I'll grab that one, and then I think I actually got to kind of tune out and start video editing. So there's a question about what kind of paper this is. This is a Strathmore 400 series sketching paper. It's about 120 gram. It's not particularly heavyweight, but the texture of it's pretty good. I recommend my students to use kind of a series of different papers. Chief among them is one called Stonehenge, but also the Strathmore paper I think is it's pretty good. I wouldn't say that it's like excellent, but it definitely does the job in terms of like giving you a no-nonsense surface that you get to kind of populate with values and shapes. You know, there are papers that might be more beautiful, but also probably they're a little bit more complicated. But all right, that's what I've got today. This ear will be up on Patreon. I really hope by the beginning of next week, but we'll see how difficult a time I have sort of snipping together all the footage. In the meantime, thank you everybody for stopping by, and take care of yourself. This drawing, so a little bit about like background here. This drawing is actually a transfer drawing. So I'm doing this as a preparation for a painting. Quick answer to a question, are you using charcoal and graphite at the same time? No, I'm mostly just using graphite. There might have been like a whisper of charcoal somewhere on the paper at some point, but nothing that I'm like really consciously integrating into what I'm doing. Someone is watching from the Cayman Islands. Love to hear that. I imagine you're having a hopefully wonderful sunny time there. But what I was saying, this is a transfer drawing. So I'm making this with the purpose of eventually transferring it onto a canvas and making a painting out of it. And so the manner of its design is maybe a little bit different than with some other drawings that I've done, maybe where they are a little bit more, I don't want to say more resolved, because that's not really it. Maybe it's that they are a little bit more meant to exist solely as a drawing, whereas this has like kind of another purpose. So like shapes like I'm creating here, I'm kind of working really hard to organize them in such a way that they'll translate really well to a painting. Someone did ask what, how I would approach an academic study. It's kind of an interesting question, because you're setting up in that question kind of a difference in between creating a drawing or an artwork for the sake of what it is, and maybe with an academic study. I think that the important thing about that really is that your approach is such that you can actually learn the idea that's implanted in that exercise. So like at the Florence Academy, you know, when you start out doing your bark drawings or cast drawings, if you kind of draw those like wild and crazy, or you try to draw it all in a single day, you're going to miss kind of everything about it. So I think that probably one of the really important things about approaching an academic study is that you have some sense of background on why it is you're studying it, right? If you're doing like a copy of a John Singer Sargent painting, for instance, right? Why would you do it? What is it about his painting that you would like to absorb? Is it the sense of color in the painting? Well, in that case, then understanding like what palette he was using would be very interesting. Understanding the manner in which he was applying those colors. Was he working in like an alla prima method, or was this a more kind of protracted study? So having that sense of background and that sense of purpose, I think is really, really useful when you're working on a study with an academic purpose. Otherwise, I think that you can still have like a very engaged time and certainly learn some things from the experience. But really, like you're trying to, I think usually you're trying to maybe get into the mindset of that artist that you're studying, or get into the basis of the thing that you're looking at, right? Is it, you know, are you doing a study from life? In that case, you know, what is the lighting that you're working with, right? Who are the artists that you're looking at in terms of developing your skills that you're trying to move in that direction of, you know? I think always kind of having that sense of purpose is a really, really big deal, and that only comes from kind of making conscious decisions based on your hopeful kind of outcome. And while that sounds like it's really kind of product oriented, I think it's okay to be a little bit product oriented, especially if the product in the end is one that has a kind of a depth and beauty. You know, that means also that you can focus on the process. I don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive, at least not in as much as they're usually kind of presented, right? That either you are a person who is into the process, or you're a person who's into the product. It's usually kind of presented in this way that you can't be both. Whereas I feel like probably for most things, when you're doing it right, hopefully both can be served, right? Of course, that's in an optimum circumstance, and it requires a lot of kind of responsibility in the sense that, like, you know, I see a lot of students, and you know, some of them go through their studies in a way that's a little bit, maybe a little bit haphazard. You know, they're there to draw and to kind of enjoy themselves, but the conscious decision making is really what kind of separates a good study from something that is maybe a little bit more random. You know, and I can also further kind of muddy the waters by saying as well, sometimes just that sense of randomness is good, because you will stumble across something that you didn't know that you should be kind of looking for. So probably striving to achieve kind of a sense of balance or harmony in a way is really appropriate certainly when you're an artist and you're kind of making these finished works, but also when you're a student and you're kind of trying to learn or understand the things that you don't already know. Someone is watching from India, maybe let me know, I really appreciate that. In fact, my studio in New Jersey is actually right down the street from a neighborhood called Little India, which is full of fantastic restaurants. So it's a bit of background on where I'm coming from. Also, like I said earlier in the stream, if any of you are already a patron, don't forget that the patrons only live stream is coming up on March 1st. And if you do have a question or a topic that you really like to hear about, you just post it in the community section of my Patreon page, and I will make a note of it and get to it during that live stream. And I'll usually get to it in depth. We've got someone from Holland as well. Shout out to Holland. Not that you are probably a football fan, but Memphis Depay is one of the great football players from Holland. Not to mention Robin van Persie. Not to mention Frans Hals and great painters from Holland as well. Someone's asking about the paper that I'm drawing on. This is a Strathmore 400 series drawing paper. It's about 120 gram. It is simultaneously not my favorite paper, in that it's maybe like a little bit flimsy, but it's also like a really kind of no-nonsense drawing paper. You know, some papers which like on their own are quite beautiful, like Arches cold press, sort of watercolor paper, you know, it has really gorgeous texture to it, but the reality is like when you're drawing on it, you can find yourself a little bit at odds with some of the texture. Whereas with the Strathmore paper, on its own, it's really kind of normal and not interesting looking. But it also kind of stays out of your way in terms of like, while you're trying to develop your values and shapes and things, it's not going to be kind of, you know, competing with you for kind of control over the value. It's a very kind of workman-like paper, you know, it just does the job it's supposed to do, nothing more, nothing less, which sounds very unromantic, but in fact, I really like it. Arches hot press paper. I'm also not super fond of the hot press. I used it years ago when I was still in Florence, and I just found that it kind of it got scarred quite quickly or quite easily. Which is to say, like if I made a mark on it and that mark was kind of not in the right place, it's really difficult to kind of, you know, kind of dial that back eventually. So I felt that was a little bit of a problem, and so I'm not over the moon about that one either. Not that I don't think, like, you can make a good drawing, I think, on either of them. It's only a matter of like just preference. And I usually like something that's a little bit more friendly to erasing. Someone's asking how long a single drawing takes. That kind of depends upon how well I'm doing. If I'm really on point and I'm really efficient, I can make a good portrait in maybe 12, 16 hours. If I'm doing really bad or it's a really challenging pose, it can take a lot longer. Someone's asking about my artwork and what I want to say, like what my kind of message is. What a question. I mean, it's a really cool question in the sense that, like, it kind of gets to the core of maybe why you start making artwork in the first place. I feel like it's also a question, the answer to which becomes more and more of a kind of gray area as time goes on. I think when I was younger, a lot of it was more about just kind of instinct. I had this instinct to draw and paint, and so kind of that's what I did. As I get older, that instinct is kind of maybe turned into a habit, and so I kind of continue to make work because I always have, because it's become like a part of my life. And as far as like maybe a message is concerned, maybe when I was young as well, I would have said that there were like kind of maybe clear messages that I wanted to present, about this or that aspect of humanity. But it's not that I have dialed back that sense of like wanting to say something. I think that it's more that the things that I want to say are a lot more open-ended, which is to say that I kind of feel like if I'm able to communicate some sense of like grace or harmony in the work that I produce, if I'm able to look at that in the world and bring that into my drawing, that sense of care, that sense of like urgency about absorbing the character of something, then I've achieved my message. Now, is that one that you can maybe, it doesn't really fit well into a soundbite or a tweet, but just transmitting your care and affection for the world around you, maybe that's my message. So I hope that answers something, gives some insight anyway. Great questions. Yeah, I'm kind of I'm at an interesting point in this drawing where I kind of needs to kind of get to where it's going, but also not totally sure of where it's going. It's kind of it's leading me more than I'm leading it right now. So we'll just kind of see where that ends up. Like I said, eventually, I'll move on from this and change it into a painting. But that takes time. Someone's asking, how can a beginner see values instead of lines? Great question. Seeing the world in terms of values is it is a multi-staged endeavor, right? Which is to say, like, you're not going to like, and I don't think you're asking for this, but you're not going to be able to like flip a switch and then see the world in terms of values. I think it takes a lot of practice in terms of like learning how to actually see things. I think starting to use like kind of really basic projects, like there's one that that I've made a few videos on about like just drawing a conceptual sphere. So you start out with a plan to see the world in this one way, right? You say that I want to see a world that is comprised of light and shadow. Then you look at your subject and you attempt to extract from what you're seeing that reality, right? So if you're looking at shadow and light, you attempt to see the value of the shadow versus the value of the light. And I think that it's actually a really great assistance to do this in a kind of controlled environment, which is to say, like, if you're drawing a portrait which is really quite complex, I think that there are other problems that are maybe are more distracting than just practicing seeing values. That's why the idea of like kind of drawing a conceptual sphere is helpful, because the sphere is not, in a sense, like a challenge for you to draw, right? So you can kind of focus just on the challenge that you do have, which is, how do I see shadow and light? So I'd say try to work on something quite simplified and work on it with a kind of preconceived idea, right? Someone's asking me to talk about the different erasers that I use. So I've got a kneaded eraser here. It kind of gets into any shape you want it to get into. I usually squeeze it down to kind of a razor thin kind of edge like that, and then go and apply it to the paper very, very gently. And it's very versatile, which is great. I also use a mono zero eraser. It's made by a company called Tombow, and it has this little end that you can click out like a mechanical pencil. And I'll use that for like kind of glazing value out of areas. Usually I don't like maybe rub too hard with this one. If I really needed to erase something, I think I would use my my kneaded eraser. Also, you know, you think maybe like I would use it more for hair than I actually do. I use it every now and again for hair, but it's not like maybe the driving force behind the shapes that I make in hair. Definitely is useful though. But those are two I use for the most part. Yeah, the Tombow makes a couple of different kind of mono zero erasers. So they make one that has kind of a chiseled tip, and they make one that has a bit of a kind of rounded tip. The one I was showing was the rounded one. I find that like maybe on a much bigger drawing, the one with the chiseled tip, you know, kind of can become useful, but mostly for what I'm doing, like at this scale, I don't really use that one too much. All right, I've got time for maybe one more question. I got to get back to actually recording the rest of the kind of audio commentary for this video, and then I got to get back home and actually start editing it, which I'm not looking forward to. But that is the reality when you make videos. You got to spend a lot of time editing them, and that is what I'm on my way to do. Had to get a little bit more work done. There's two questions that came in really quick. What are your tips about artistic simplification on life drawing as it's been done for casts, and how do you balance between hard lines and soft edges? Wow. All right. The first question's, well, neither question is easy to answer, but hey, I'll just shoot for it. Everything in the world that you're going to draw can come out of lines like this. Essentially, straight lines with angle breaks. I've talked about this topic a lot, where when you draw straight lines and angle breaks, what it means is that each time you're making a line segment, you're also making a decision about that line segment. When you draw a long, kind of unbroken, swirling line like the one I just drew on the right, really there's only one decision in it. So this conscious sense of applying angles to the world that you're seeing, I think it gives you a kind of a basis for creating choices when you're drawing. It also means that you're kind of working in a highly kind of simplified manner, which is actually the biggest part of the endeavor when you're sort of drawing at the beginning of a drawing, right? It's about how much information can you take away so that you can focus on core kind of foundational aspects like proportion, like construction, like gesture, and so on. So straight lines, clear angle breaks, and ultimately as much simplification as possible. The question you want to have in your mind, or the objective you want to have in mind is, how can I create the simplest possible expression of the subject? And each part of that objective is just as important as the other, right? So creating a simplification is important, but also expressing the subject is important. So if you've done one and not the other, then you've kind of done like half of the job. What was the, I forgot what the next question was. Let's see, the other question was, how do you find a balance between hard lines and soft edges? Well, it's all out there in nature. It's just the same way that you like find a balance in between dark values and light values. I look at my edges the same as that, right? So I look ultimately for one of the hardest edges, and I compare it to the edges that I find in another area. And by observing that kind of relationship consistently throughout the drawing, I'm able to kind of create a kind of harmonious scale between sharp and soft edges. It's all about relationships. If all of your edges are hard, then you have not a spectrum. It's like if in your drawing all your values are super light, you will not have kind of contrast. It's like in skin tones, if all of your color is of a warm temperature, the warm temperatures won't seem to be warm. You'll get a kind of a Barbie doll effect. So just understand that it's like about a spectrum, and it's about relationships. But it's also about the end. I've got to, like I said, I got to get a little bit more recording done on this, and then I got to get back home and do a whole lot of video editing. I have my tutorial on ears is going to come out. I'm really hoping in the first couple days of next week, and then of course, I'm going to be releasing at least a couple of stages of this drawing on March 1st. So. If you haven't signed up to Patreon and that kind of thing is interesting to you, you can just follow the link in my bio. And if you already have, then please don't forget that the Patrons Only live stream is coming on March 1st. Please put whatever questions you have in the community section of my Patreon page, and I will address them at length during the March 1st live stream. If you have the question, in the next couple seconds, I will get to it. Someone's asking, how do you measure an outline? That's a complicated question. I mean, you look at really all of the contours in relationship to each other. Oh, that's the question. How do you measure an outline? I'm not sure really how to answer that. I mean, it's all about comparison. So the length of the nose versus the length of the bottom half of the face, the relationship of this angle versus this one. It's all about kind of an interrelationship. Someone asked, how do you know when you're finished? That's changed over the years. But usually I just try to either A, kind of satisfy my interest in the subject, or B, when the deadline arrives, then you know you're done. But all right, once again, I gotta run, but thank you everybody for stopping by and listening to me chat about a bunch of stuff.